Welcome, eerie tales of isolation, where rain falls steadily, shadows grow, and the only thing scarier than being alone is realizing you might not be. Tonight, join me on a journey through stories that unfold in the damp, chilling embrace of midnight showers. These are tales of those who braved the rain and found more than they bargained for. Story 1. The Watcher on the Road. Lydia was driving home late at night, her windshield wipers working furiously against the pounding rain. It was a desolate stretch of road, one where cell service faded away and headlights were the only sign of life. She knew this route well, a shortcut through farmlands that cut her journey time nearly in half. But tonight, the rain was relentless, and the darkness seemed to cling to her car, thick and unyielding. As she rounded a sharp curve, she caught sight of something on the side of the road, a figure in the rain, standing perfectly still, facing away. Lydia's heart raced. She couldn't see the face, only the silhouette. Just a man in an old, soaked raincoat, unmoving, his head tilted slightly to the side, as if he was listening to something. She debated driving past. She'd heard warnings about picking up strangers on this lonely road, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he needed help. She slowed down, rolling her window down just a crack, enough to ask if he was okay. "Excuse me, sir?" she called out, her voice barely carrying over the rain. The figure didn't move. She waited a moment, then turned her headlights a bit more in his direction. That's when she noticed he was standing at the edge of a ditch. At first, she thought he was simply caught in the storm, but as the light fell upon him, she saw what he was looking at. Another figure lay face down in the water-filled ditch, unmoving. Her heart sank as she realized the man was grinning, slowly, his head turned, locking eyes with her, eyes that were impossibly wide, and a grin that stretched too far. Without thinking, Lydia floored the gas. The road seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the rain slamming against her windshield harder, as though the night itself were trying to swallow her. She never looked back. Story 2. Footsteps in the Rain. Derek had always loved late-night jogs in the rain. Something about the solitude and the soft patter of raindrops soothed him. But one night, as he rounded the corner of an old park, he began to feel uneasy. He couldn't shake the sensation that he wasn't alone. At first, he brushed it off, blaming his overactive imagination. But then, he heard footsteps. They echoed just behind him, matching his pace, faint but unmistakable in the downpour. He turned quickly, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the path was empty, lined only with shadows and flickering streetlights. He took a deep breath, tried to laugh it off, and continued jogging. But the footsteps were back, now louder, closer. A sense of dread pooled in his stomach, and he began to run, faster and faster, hoping to lose whatever was following him. But no matter how fast he went, the footsteps stayed right behind him. He couldn't bring himself to look back again, terrified of what he might see. At last, he reached his apartment, bursting through the door and locking it behind him. He took a deep breath, letting out a shaky laugh. But then, he heard it. A single wet footprint in the hallway behind him, and then another and another, heading straight toward him. Story 3. The Window Visitor. Jess had always felt safe in her small, cozy house, nestled at the edge of town. On rainy nights, she'd curl up on her couch with a blanket and a cup of tea, listening to the rhythmic patter against the windows. But tonight was different. Tonight, a feeling of unease settled over her, like the rain was hiding something. As she tried to relax, a noise caught her attention, a soft tapping against her living room window. At first, she thought it was just a branch brushing in the wind, but as the minutes passed, the tapping grew more insistent, steady, and purposeful. She hesitated, not wanting to look, but curiosity got the best of her. She approached the window slowly, her heart pounding with each step. Pulling back the curtain just a bit, she peered out, and her breath caught in her throat. A face was pressed against the glass, half hidden by a hood. The figure was soaked, their pale eyes staring unblinkingly at her, mouth moving as if trying to speak. The rain trickled down their face, and though they looked drenched and cold, there was something wrong about the expression. Jess took a step back, frozen in fear. Then, gathering her courage, she called out, "Can I help you?" The figure's mouth continued to move soundlessly. Her heart raced. Story 2. The Voice in the Snow. Our next story brings us to the barren countryside of northern Canada, where winter nights are long and the snow is deep. There, you'll find an isolated farm, a place where time seems to have frozen, forgotten by the world. Inside, a young man, alone, waits for spring, but the snow hides secrets, and when night falls, he begins to hear something. A voice calling to him from the cold, and he's the only one who can hear it. Samuel Jennings had lived alone on his family's farm since his parents had passed, tucked miles away from the nearest town. The winters were brutal here, and the snow could pile so high that leaving the house was impossible for days. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. No neighbors, no traffic, just the vast, snowy landscape stretching for miles. But this winter, something felt wrong. Samuel spent his days caring for the livestock, the only companions he had out here. The nights, however, had grown darker and colder than usual, and the silence outside seemed different. It was hard to describe, but it felt as if the snow itself was listening. One night, as he was about to head to bed, he heard it, a faint, distant call from somewhere out in the snow. He froze, straining to listen, but the sound stopped almost as soon as it began. He shook his head, telling himself it was the wind, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at him even after he lay down. The voice had sounded like a whisper, just clear enough to register, but too faint to make out. The following night, as Samuel prepared his dinner, he heard it again. This time, he stepped out onto the porch, his breath visible in the icy air as he listened closely. There it was, unmistakable, his own name drifting through the silence, but no one was around. He squinted into the snowy expanse, heart pounding, expecting to see something or someone moving, but the world outside remained still, cloaked in white. Samuel was a rational man, but even he couldn't ignore what he'd heard. His own name, faint and distant, carried by the wind. He brushed it off as his mind playing tricks on him, but deep down, he knew that something was wrong, and the snow was only getting deeper. Story 3. The Figure in the Science Lab. The final story brings us to a high school in Michigan where students encountered a figure who seemed to be trapped between worlds. It was a quiet afternoon at Benton High School, and the final period was about to end. The science lab was full of students working on their end-of-day projects, and everyone was focused on finishing up. But just as the bell was about to ring, the PA system crackled. This is a lockdown. Teachers, lock your doors and remain silent. Mr. Jacobs, the chemistry teacher, locked the door and instructed everyone to stay calm. He turned off the lights, and the room fell into a tense silence. Just a few minutes in, they heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, deliberate, and dragging, as if someone was shuffling slowly through the hall. A curious student, Logan, peered through the small window in the lab door. His face went pale as he stepped back, whispering that he had seen something. There was a man standing in the hallway, but he didn't look right. He was tall, with a pale, almost translucent face, and dark eyes that seemed to stare right through him. Logan whispered to his friend that the man was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, something you'd expect to see in a black and white photo. But it was his eyes that truly terrified him, empty, hollow, and fixed on the lab door, as if he knew they were watching. As they waited, the man walked up to the door, his gaze locked on them. He lifted a hand and gently tapped on the glass. The students held their breath, paralyzed with fear. Mr. Jacobs motioned for them to stay quiet, but the figure outside seemed to sense them, staring in, never blinking. Finally, the footsteps moved away, and the figure disappeared down the hall. When the lockdown lifted, the students flooded out of the lab, their faces pale and shaken. They learned later that the school had once been a hospital during an influenza outbreak in the early 1900s, and several patients had reportedly passed away in that very hallway. To this day, students at Benton High claim to hear strange sounds, whispers, and occasionally see the shadow of a man in an old-fashioned suit wandering the halls. Some say he's just waiting for someone to let him in. Story 3. The Figure in the Science Lab. The final story brings us to a high school in Michigan where students encountered a figure who seemed to be trapped between worlds. It was a quiet afternoon at Benton High School, and the final period was about to end. The science lab was full of students working on their end-of-day projects, and everyone was focused on finishing up. But just as the bell was about to ring, the PA system crackled. This is a lockdown. Teachers, lock your doors and remain silent. Mr. Jacobs, the chemistry teacher, locked the door and instructed everyone to stay calm. He turned off the lights, and the room fell into a tense silence. Just a few minutes in, they heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, deliberate, and dragging, as if someone was shuffling slowly through the hall. A curious student, Logan, peered through the small window in the lab door. His face went pale as he stepped back, whispering that he had seen something. There was a man standing in the hallway, but he didn't look right. He was tall, with a pale, almost translucent face, and dark eyes that seemed to stare right through him. Logan whispered to his friend that the man was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, something you'd expect to see in a black and white photo. But it was his eyes that truly terrified him, empty, hollow, and fixed on the lab door, as if he knew they were watching. As they waited, the man walked up to the door, his gaze locked on them. He lifted a hand and gently tapped on the glass. The students held their breath, paralyzed with fear. Mr. Jacobs motioned for them to stay quiet, but the figure outside seemed to sense them, staring in, never blinking. Finally, the footsteps moved away, and the figure disappeared down the hall. When the lockdown lifted, the students flooded out of the lab, their faces pale and shaken. They learned later that the school had once been a hospital during an influenza outbreak in the early 1900s, and several patients had reportedly passed away in that very hallway. To this day, students at Benton High claim to hear strange sounds, whispers, and occasionally See the shadow of a man in an old-fashioned suit wandering the halls. Some say he's just waiting for someone to let him in. Story 4. The Man by the Streetlight. Carlos had finished his shift at the diner. The streets deserted as he walked home. Rain fell softly, making the sidewalk glisten under the dim streetlights. The only sounds were his own footsteps and the distant hum of electricity from the old lights. As he neared the corner, he saw something odd under one of the streetlights ahead. A man stood there, completely still, his head bowed. His clothes looked old, worn, and completely soaked, as if he'd been standing in the rain for hours. Carlos slowed his pace, not sure what to make of the figure. The man didn't move. He just stood there, perfectly still, with his head lowered so that his face was hidden. As Carlos walked past the man, he kept his distance, glancing over briefly to see if he would react. But the figure remained as still as a statue, head bowed, water dripping from his long coat. Carlos felt a chill run through him and hurried past. But a few moments later, he stopped. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Slowly, he turned around. The man had raised his head and was now staring directly at him, his face barely visible under the glow of the streetlight. A look of sorrow, or perhaps anger, was etched deeply into his expression, and his eyes were dark and hollow. Carlos took a step back, heart pounding. The man's gaze didn't waver, and Carlos could feel the weight of it as though it were pressing him into the ground. Trying not to panic, he turned and walked faster, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He felt that heavy gaze following him with every step. When he finally dared to look back again, the streetlight was empty. The man was gone. But that night, every time Carlos passed a streetlight on his way home, he felt as though someone was standing there, just out of sight, waiting for him to look back. Good evening, dear listeners. Tonight we gather around the warmth of the fire, but only in spirit. For in these stories, the chill of winter seeps deeper than the bone, drifting into places where warmth is but a memory. If you're here with me now, alone, on this cold winter night, then know these stories are meant for you. It's said that on nights like these, when shadows are long and the world grows silent, the things that dwell in darkness come closer than ever. But be warned, the further you delve, the harder it is to return to the world you know. So, settle in and listen if you dare. Story 1. The Snowbound Cabin. Our first story brings us to the snow-covered mountains of Wyoming. Picture this: a lone cabin, its weathered wood barely visible beneath a blanket of snow, nestled far from any road or town. Inside, someone waits for the storm to end. But what he doesn't know is that he's not as alone as he thinks. Martin Stevens had planned this trip for months. He needed the solitude. The pressures of life back in the city had been suffocating him, and with each passing day, he'd grown more restless. He'd rented this remote cabin with the hopes of clearing his mind, of finding some peace, maybe even rediscovering the passion that had slowly faded from his life. The first few days were bliss. He hiked, read, and even kept a journal. The forest around the cabin was dense, the snow thick and untouched, and he reveled in the beauty of the undisturbed landscape. But as the storm arrived on the fourth day, it felt as though the world itself had turned hostile. Martin's fire crackled weakly, and he huddled closer, warming his hands. The snow was falling faster now, piling against the windows in thick, heavy drifts. He hadn't seen another person in days, and while that solitude had once seemed appealing, it now felt suffocating. He turned his attention to his journal, scratching words onto the page in the dim light. But as he wrote, a chill crept up his spine, colder than the wind howling outside. It was that odd feeling of being watched. He shrugged it off, blaming it on the isolation, the sheer strangeness of being so far from anyone else. But the feeling didn't leave. There it was again. A sound. He held his breath, straining to hear over the storm. It sounded like footsteps, soft and steady, crunching in the snow just beyond the window. He told himself it was just a tree branch, or perhaps an animal. But then he heard it again, this time closer. Heart pounding, he moved to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly, squinting into the swirling snow. At first he saw nothing, only the dense whiteness filling the world outside. But as his eyes adjusted, a dark figure appeared through the haze. A tall, cloaked figure, standing just at the tree line. perfectly still, almost blending with the shadows of the pines. Narrator, whispering as though sharing a dark secret. There was no road leading to this cabin, no path that could have brought anyone here in weather like this. Martin knew that, and yet there he was, a figure, unmoving, shrouded in shadow, staring directly at him. Martin stepped back from the window, his heart racing. He didn't want to believe what he'd just seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a hallucination brought on by his isolation. He decided to wait it out, hoping that when he looked again, the figure would be gone. But the feeling of dread clung to him, growing heavier with each passing moment. The minutes dragged on, and he paced the small cabin, glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see that shadowy figure at the window. But it never came closer. Not yet.